I was very lucky to have a great upbringing. Grew up in a small town, and everybody knew everybody. We had a small church I grew up in and got to know the Lord at a very early age, and a great youth group also, which helped kind of give me a foundation for the rest of my life. And so everything in my life growing up was just perfect. As a young adult, through church, I met a young lady, and we knew each other growing up. And next thing you know, as teenagers do, we started kind of eyeing each other. One thing led to another, and we were a couple. And so all through high school, we were thick and thin. Tommy and Terry, Terry and Tommy. You couldn't separate us. We did everything together. We knew that we wanted to spend the rest of our life together. And so we started making plans for that. We got through high school, we started college, we also started our careers, and then we started planning a wedding. And so that same church that we attended, we both were baptized there, and we both got married in the same home church. Life just couldn't get any better. We started planning a family, we had a home, started building that up, and after a few years, our daughter was born. Raising her in a small town, it was just a perfect scenario. And so careers, we kept moving up in our careers and started planning for another child and for our family to grow. The Lord blessed us again, and we were pregnant. Life was really moving along and things were great. One day, after about a week of not feeling well, Terry had gone to her doctor. She had a headache. She was dehydrated. She was getting nauseated. She couldn't keep food down. And she really wasn't feeling like herself. We knew something wasn't right. They got her on an IV, got her feeling better, and sent her home for the weekend. We were going to go back to the doctor Monday. And so this was on a Friday. We came home for the weekend. We had a great weekend together, but still things just wasn't the same. She wasn't herself. I was really concerned and couldn't wait to get back to the doctor on Monday. We had some time together after church. Terry was actually relaxing outside in a chair outside on the porch. And I could see through the glass window, storm door, that I would kind of keep an eye on her. And I noticed at one point in time, she had actually slumped back in her chair and was just not moving, was just totally relaxed. She actually dropped what was in her hands, and just her hands were open. Well, I rushed outside to try to revive her, and she wouldn't wake up. I tried to pick her up, and she was just limp. Just total dead weight. And so the first thing I thought of was I got to call 911. So I carefully got her inside, laid her on her back, called 911. It took some time for the ambulance to get there, but the ambulance did. I followed her all the way back to the hospital. It was about a good 20, 30-minute drive. I was by myself in the ER, not knowing what was going on, and they wouldn't give me any answers. Not long after that, the ER doctor came back to me, and all he said was, "We hate to tell you this, but your wife has cancer." Everything just fell apart for me. I didn't know what to think. They did some scans, and it seems like she had brain cancer. And that's all the details they'd give me. Then they'd rush off and go to work. God really helped me realize that, hey, we need to fight this. We're going to fight this. We're going to beat this. No matter what happens in life, I'm going to be okay. Terry's going to be okay. Our family's going to be fine. We're going to fight this. And the unique part about my situation was I didn't have time really to process that whole conversation before the doctors had a chance to come back to me and my family. And we were all together, and they talked to us. They said, "We need to talk about the situation. Here's what we know as of now. The tests have come back, and there's nothing we can do for Terry." They told me she was not going to ever wake up, that she was brain dead, and that Terry was over. There were folks literally in the room that were upset and screaming no out loud. There was a lot of crying, a lot of why, what's going on? What do you mean there's nothing that we can do? I felt alone. Life stopped, not just for Terry, but it stopped for me. And I didn't know where to turn. What is my direction going to be now? It was just like getting hit by a ton of bricks at the time. It's just life basically stopped at that moment.
It seems like stories like Tommy's are pretty common in our world. I mean, we don't really have to look very far until we bump into a story of pain or hurt or suffering or sorrow. Every one of us can tell a story of a time that our lives intersected with something like that. And for some of us, it's a personal story, isn't it? For some of us, your story of when you bumped into it had to do with a friend or a loved one who maybe much like Tommy's wife had cancer. And you begged and you pleaded and you bargained with God. And then one day you found yourself standing by a graveside, saying goodbye to somebody that in your mind it was far too early to say goodbye to. Maybe your story of pain and hurt and tragedy has to do with someone who abused you and took advantage of you. Perhaps for others of you, it has to do with a marriage that started out so promising. I mean, you really felt like you were marrying your soulmate. And you had dreams about happily ever after, but you got into the marriage and before you know it, the person who was supposed to be treating you with the greatest love is now treating you in ways, and they're hurting you in ways you couldn't have possibly imagined beforehand. And then happily ever after starts to look like a pipe dream. Or maybe your story of when you encountered hurt or pain or sorrow or tragedy happened around a prodigal son or a prodigal daughter. Someone you loved, someone you poured your heart into, you instilled values, and then they walked away from all of it. And they've been gone for a long time, and there's a part of you that thinks, man, they're just never going to come back. Maybe it was the death of a dream, but we all have encountered pain and hurt and sorrow, haven't we? And when we do, there are certain questions that just bubble to the surface almost naturally. We wonder, well, why is this happening? And where is God? And why would God allow this to happen to that person? Or why would God allow this to happen to me? Or maybe even the broader question, why does God sometimes allow bad things to happen to good people? Today, we're kicking off a brand new sermon series that we're doing entitled, I Want to Believe But. And today I want to tackle this subject. I want to believe, but sometimes God seems heartless. Because when we encounter pain, when we stare it in the face, when we wrestle with it, when we ask the questions, deep down underneath all of it, there's a part of us that goes, I really want to believe. I want to put my trust in God. I want to trust him, but God, sometimes it seems like you don't care. And let me be really honest with you guys on the very front end of our conversation this morning. I am not going to be able to resolve every tension and every question that you have around this subject in our time here together this morning. But what I would like to do is when we talk about these two things, pain and God and where they intersect with one another, I would like to this morning take a look at a story in the Bible where some people encountered some very real pain. Very real pain, very real tragedy, and they intersected with God, and in the middle of it, they learned some important lessons about God and pain. Some lessons that I think will serve us well as we encounter pain in our world and in our own lives. So if you have your Bible or a Bible app on your mobile device, would you turn with me to John chapter 11? John chapter 11. If you don't have either of those things, don't sweat it. We're going to put all this stuff up on the screens for you so that you can follow along. Our story begins in verse 1, and it begins this way. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. A few pieces of information right up front. Bethany is a village. It's a kind of a suburb village of Jerusalem. It's about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus are siblings. They grew up together, and they all have a very unique, very special relationship with God. With Jesus. They're just very close friends with him. In fact, anytime Jesus would come through the area, Jesus would stop and he would spend time with them, and they would enjoy his company, and he would enjoy their company. And they know what Jesus is capable of because they've seen Jesus do things. They've seen Jesus heal people from all kinds of different stuff. They've seen Jesus heal people he knew, and they've seen Jesus heal people that were complete strangers that he had never met before. They are completely convinced in their mind that Jesus can do something about Lazarus' sickness. Now, when this story takes place, Jesus and his disciples, at least when the story starts right here, Jesus and his disciples are in a village about 20 miles away from Bethany. It's about a day to a day and a half walk for a person to get there from Bethany. But Lazarus is getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and Mary and Martha are getting more and more and more and more desperate. So in the next verse we read, so the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now that is an interesting way to introduce someone, isn't it? They get a messenger together and they send the messenger to Jesus, and the message is just, Lord, the one that you love is sick. They don't give him any details. They don't even give him a name. They just assume, because of the relationship that exists, that Jesus is going to know, that Jesus is going to care, and that Jesus is going to do something. The disciples probably assume the same. They probably start getting ready to go back to Bethany, kind of mentally preparing, okay, we got to do this and this and this before we go. Then Jesus looks back at the messenger, and here's what he says. He says, when I heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. Now, by the time the messenger actually got to Jesus with the messenger didn't know this, but Lazarus was already dead. So it seems strange that Jesus might say that. But Jesus isn't saying that Lazarus won't die. He's just saying that this thing will not ultimately end up in the death of Lazarus. The disciples are kind of curious, they lean in, and then Jesus says something on the heels of this that totally messes with the disciples' theology. It might end up messing with yours too. You see, the disciples, they grew up in a world that taught them that if you were a good person, God rewarded you and good things happened to you. And if you were a bad person, God punished you and bad things happened to you. And so if somebody was sick, it was because they were a bad person and God was punishing them. But what Jesus says next opens up a brand new category for the disciples. And perhaps it opens up a brand new category for you too. Maybe for some of you, this is the first time you will have ever heard it. So Jesus waits till his disciples are listening and paying attention because he doesn't want them to miss what he's about to say. And here's what he tells them. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. And the disciples are reeling. They're trying to figure this out. And Jesus, hold on, are you saying that God, that he uses sickness and that he uses pain and he uses tragedy and he uses sorrow? Jesus, are you saying that God uses those for his glory? And Jesus is like, yeah. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Now, at this point in the story, the writer John, the one who records this story for us, he decides to take a little bit of a time out from the story, and he gives us an editorial comment, something that he feels like is important for us to know that he doesn't want us to miss, because the story is going to get a little bit crazy from here. So here's what he says. He says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now, the reason why he says this is because he knows that what we're about to read next is going to seem like Jesus doesn't love them. We're going to be tempted to believe that somehow Jesus doesn't care, and John knows it. So he tells us, look, just for clarity, Jesus loved them. Don't forget this, Jesus loved them. And then he goes on, and here's what he says. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, talking about Jesus, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Jesus hears about Lazarus' sickness. He knows about the pain. He knows about what's going on. He even probably knows, I believe, that Lazarus was dead. And instead of rushing back to Bethany like you and I would expect, Jesus goes back to doing what he was doing before the messenger even arrived. Someone once described this whole thing as the strange tardiness of Jesus. The disciples shrug their shoulders. They come to the conclusion, I guess everything's going to be okay. Jesus doesn't seem too concerned. And they just kind of go back to doing what they were doing before this all started. And then all of a sudden we read, and then he said to his disciples a couple days afterwards, let us go back to Judea. The disciples are not really excited about this idea, so they say to Jesus, look, but Rabbi, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back. So they say to Jesus, Jesus, I don't know how this got hazy in your mind. I mean, it's pretty clear in ours, but look, last time we were there, they tried to stone you. Look, last time we were in the area of Bethany, Jesus, things didn't go really all that well. Now, we learn later on in the story that the disciples, at least in this sentence, seem like they're trying to help Jesus think through the wise decision here, but really they have their own self-interest in mind. See, underneath this statement is also this statement that they're making. Jesus, when people try to stone you, they're likely to try to stone us too. And we're fond of being alive. So Jesus listens to what his disciples say, and then he does something that Jesus did to his disciples all the time. I mean, it had to drive them nuts. He turns to them and he tells them a parable. And here's what he says to them. He goes, look, are there not 12 hours of daylight? And the disciples are going, well, yeah, and why are we talking about this? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. And then Jesus just stops talking. And the disciples are like, yeah? And? Now, they don't understand what Jesus is talking about here, but what Jesus is doing is he's talking to them about time, and he's talking to them about opportunity. He's subtly saying some things about himself, and here's kind of what he's trying to tell them. Look, you're only going to have me for a little while. And while I'm here, I can make certain things clear for you. I can clear up some confusion. I can do things that will help you, because not too long from now, guys, I'm not going to be around anymore. And you're going to need to have seized the opportunity that you have with me right now. He wants them to know, look, I'm going to Bethany, and I'm going to do something there that you need to see, that you need to watch, that you need to be a part of, because it's going to shape you, and it's going to help you for your entire life. But the disciples are confused. They don't understand. So then Jesus tries to, elaborate a little bit, and he goes, well, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. To which the disciples respond and they go, oh, well, if he sleeps, he'll get better. They decide to give Jesus some medical advice. Jesus, I'm not sure if you know how illness works, and we're not medical professionals, some of our fishermen, some of our tax collectors, whatever, but look, here's the deal. Generally, people who are sick need to sleep. It's part of the healing process, and we probably shouldn't go wake them up, because if we wake them up, we'll probably do more hurt than harm, and whatever. And it's just Jesus. Maybe we should just stay here. Now, of course, Jesus is trying to tell his disciples that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, but they don't know. So then he has to get really direct, and he says, "Look, Lazarus is dead." And the disciples are confused. Wait a minute, hold on, time out, Jesus. Look, earlier on, you said this thing wasn't going to end up in Lazarus dying or anything like that. And then you said that strange thing about using hurt and pain and difficulty and trial and all that sort of stuff for God's glory. And then you told us he was asleep, and then we're going to go wake him up. And now you're telling us he's dead? What? Jesus, you're not making any sense. So Jesus then goes on to say what may end up being one of the most insensitive sounding things that he ever says. He looks at his disciples, and here's what he tells them: "And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Now, for clarity, Jesus isn't saying he's glad for the pain. He's not glad for the sorrow of Mary and Martha. He's not glad for the pain of Lazarus or the glad for the death of Lazarus. What Jesus is glad for is an opportunity to help somebody's faith grow and mature. Because not too long from now, Jesus knows that he's not going to be around anymore. And he knows these guys are going to lead his new movement, his church. And it's going to involve a lot of difficulty and a lot of pain and a lot of trials. And he knows there's some lessons that they have to learn right now that will prepare them for what they're going to go through one day. So he tells his guys, I'm going to use this to grow your faith. We got to go. We got to go. So then we read, then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, and this is the funniest speech ever, let us also go that we may die with him. I really think he's trying to kind of muster some courage and try to draw out courage in everybody else, but it ends up becoming one of the most uninspiring speeches ever in the history of mankind. Let's all go and die too. I mean, it's just so sad. But the story continues. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. You know, there's so much that this verse just skips over. It skips over the moments where Mary and Martha are sitting by their brother's bedside, and they're begging, and they're pleading, and they're bargaining with God. God, if you'll just save my brother, if you'll just help, I'll be a good person, I'll go to church, I'll do whatever you want me to do. Jesus, I'm begging you, please come, please hurry. This verse here, it totally skips over the moments as they sit and they watch their brother get worse and worse and worse and worse, and they watch his breathing become more and more and more labored. This verse totally skips over that moment when they look across the bed at each other and they realize this thing's not going to turn out the way that we were begging Jesus to make it turn out. Jesus isn't going to do what we wanted him to do. This verse skips over the moment. And some of you have had moments like this, where they leaned over the bedside of their brother and they spoke what they knew would end up being some of the final words in this life to him. And they told him that they loved him and that they cared for him and they're grateful for him and that they're going to miss him. Maybe they leaned over the bed and kissed him on the forehead or the cheek, or maybe they picked up his hand and rubbed it and tried their best to comfort them and comfort their brother and maybe even comfort themselves too, and then kissed his brother's hand just one more time. This verse totally skips over all that. It totally skips over the moment when they watched their brother breathe his last breath. And all of a sudden, there's this mixture of relief and grief for them. They're relieved that their brother is no longer in pain, but they're heartbroken that he's dead. This verse skips over that. This verse doesn't say anything about the funeral, where people stood up and talked about their brother and talked about how great he was and how he'd impacted their lives. It doesn't say anything. It totally skips over the moment where they stood there and they watched their brother with tears running down their face be placed in his final resting place. We're just simply told, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. It's a very important detail right here for 4 days. The Jewish people had this superstition. They believed that when a person died, that person's spirit would literally hover over the body for 3 days, waiting and looking for an opportunity to re-inhabit the body. But on the 4th day, the decomposition of the body, they believed, would start affecting the face. And the spirit would no longer be able to recognize the body, and then the spirit would take off for good. For them, 4 days was when a person became permanently and irrevocably dead. So Jesus shows up when everybody feels like all hope is lost. This thing is a done deal. And then we read, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. I don't really know this. I'm kind of reading between the lines, but But I think Mary stayed home probably for some of the reasons why you might stay home too. I think she was mad at God. I think she was mad at Jesus. Jesus, you could have. Jesus, you should have. Jesus, I asked. Jesus, you weren't there when I needed you. Jesus, you could have helped and you did nothing. Jesus, I saw you heal perfect strangers and you didn't even show up for the one that you loved. I think Mary stayed home because she's mad. But Martha makes her way out when she sees Jesus. She says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. We've all had moments like that with God. God, if only you had have been there. God, if only you would have been there and helped and answered my prayer, then my loved one who had cancer would still be around today. God, if you had only answered my prayer and if you'd only helped me and if you'd only been there, my marriage would still be intact. God, if you were only there, if you would have only helped, then the deal would not have fallen apart. God, where are you? I love the honesty of what Martha's doing here. It's an expression. It's a mixed expression of grief and faith, and she's doing everything she can to cling to faith, but it's hanging by a thread. And so then she says, "Look, I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. God, I'm having a hard time. Jesus, I'm having a hard time holding on to my faith in you." So then Jesus responds, "Your brother will rise again." Now, Jesus here is trying to communicate what he's about to do to Martha. But Martha doesn't understand. Because in their day and age, just like in our day and age, there were things that you said commonly at funerals that were meant to try to help and comfort. We do it. We tell people, well, they're in a better place, or, you'll get to see them one day. In Jesus' day, they would say this, "Your brother will rise again." So Martha thinks that Jesus is just trying to comfort her. She responds this way. She goes, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus, I believe that there's going to be a resurrection like everybody else, and I believe that there's coming a day where I'll see my brother again, but Jesus, that's not doing anything about my pain now. I don't want him one day. I want him now. And then Jesus responds this way, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they will die." Martha, you're used to thinking about a resurrection as a future thing, as an event that's going to happen. Martha, Jesus tells Martha, look, the resurrection and the life, the thing that you long for, the thing that you need, the thing that everybody needs is not merely an event, it's a person. And it's that person, he tells Martha, I'm standing right in front of you. Here's how I would translate what Jesus is saying. Look, he's telling Martha, look, I am all that you need. I am enough. I'm going to make sure that this pain and this difficulty and this suffering, that it doesn't go to waste. Martha, I'm enough. Not one day. I'm enough right now, in the middle of your pain, in the middle of your hurt, in the middle of your sorrow, in the middle of your difficulty. I am all you need. I'm enough. And then Jesus says this, and whoever lives by believing in me, or whoever lives by trusting in me, will never die. And then he asks Martha this question, do you believe me? Do you trust me? Do you trust that I'm going to work this out for God's glory, that I'm not going to let your pain get wasted? It's a question that he asked Martha, but it's also a question for you and me too. In those moments when we're faced with pain and grief and sorrow, do you trust me? So Martha responds this way. She says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who has come into the world. She re-ups on her faith and she goes, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I'm having a hard time with it. The grief is overwhelming me, but I trust you. So Martha runs back into the house and finds Mary. She says, look, I know you're mad. I know you don't want to talk to him, but you've got to go talk to Jesus. She makes her way out to Jesus, and Jesus and Mary have a very similar conversation, pretty much identical conversation that Jesus has with Martha. And then we read these words, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Something inside starts stirring. And so Jesus says, look, where have you laid him? Come and see, they said. And as they're making their way over to where Lazarus has been laid to rest, as Jesus watches the grief of Mary and Martha and their friends, we read what may end up being the shortest but most powerful verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. In the Greek, it carries this idea that Jesus burst into tears. This was not a singular tear running down the face of Jesus. This was ugly crying. Jesus didn't stand there in the middle of their pain, in the middle of their sorrow, in the middle of their grief. He didn't stand there and just sort of stand aloof. He didn't stand there and scold them either. He didn't say, look, I told you this would work out. I told you to trust me. Why aren't you trusting me? Jesus just merely enters into their grief. And he hurts with those that are hurting. And as he does this, he leaves behind a very important truth that I don't want you to miss. The one that heals our pain also feels our pain. Jesus, the one that in the story that was going to heal everybody's pain, even knowing what he was about to do, still entered into their pain with them. He hurt with those who were hurting, and he still does today. The story continues. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? Clearly, this was no act. This was a sincere act of grief. Still others said, look, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Translation, hey, maybe Jesus really doesn't have the power that everybody thinks that he has. Maybe he's crying because he couldn't have done anything about it. The story continues, and he take away the stone. So they get over to where Lazarus is at and where he's been buried. And Jesus tells them, take away the stone. But Lord, Martha said, by this time, there's a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. And I think this is just one last sort of passive-aggressive statement on behalf of Martha. Jesus, the body's already decomposing. Because, by the way, he died 4 days ago and you were nowhere to be found. Now you want to go see him. So Jesus responds to Martha and he says, look, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Martha, I made you a promise. I told you I won't waste pain. I told you that pain gets used and hurt gets used for the glory of God and for ultimate good. I made you a promise, Martha. Haven't you? Don't forget, Martha, I made you a promise. And by the way, that's a promise he still makes you and me today, too. God doesn't waste a hurt. So the story continues, and so they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and he starts praying. And this is the funniest prayer for me in the entire Bible that Jesus prays. Because normally he had these deep, kind of like, wow. And in this one, here's what Jesus does. He goes, "Dear Heavenly Father, you and I have talked about this, and so I don't really need to really talk more about you. I'm just doing this so everybody will pay attention and nobody will miss what we're about to do and what's about to happen. Okay, Jesus, God, has everybody paying attention? Okay, amen. Let's get this thing going. Here's how Jesus prays. He says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you have sent me." And I imagine Jesus did this with a really loud voice, and he did it as long as he needed to until everybody was paying attention. He didn't want anybody to miss what was about to happen. And then we read, when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, so here's what happens. Jesus does this, and if I were a betting man, I would bet that there are people standing by the graveside that just thought, "You got to be kidding me. This is the silliest thing I've ever seen. Like, really?" And then all of a sudden, a man who had been dead for 4 days starts walking out of the tomb. Grave clothes, linen wrapped around him. And they are shocked because they have never seen anything like this before. They didn't even know that this could happen. And they're just standing there trying to figure out what to do, watching it. And Jesus kind of has to shake them out of it. Hey guys, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And then we read, therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. And you would have too, if you'd have seen Jesus did what Jesus did on this day. Seeing is believing, and these people have seen something that they absolutely cannot deny. And so people everywhere, far and wide, start deciding to trust and follow Jesus. Now, all of this is just the warm-up act. This is just the beginning. This is just a foreshadowing of something bigger, something better, something far more profound that Jesus was going to do. Jesus was just leveraging the moment. He was just using the hurt. He was using the pain to bring about the glory of God. Because word spread from this moment, it spread pretty quickly to the religious leaders, and they had this big meeting where they decided, man, Jesus has to go. And they plotted to take his life. And a couple weeks later, they would end up being successful. Jesus would die on the cross for your sin and for mine. He would die on the cross for the sinful decisions that we make that usher pain into our world and into the worlds of people around us. And then 3 days later, the resurrection and the life, the one that raised Lazarus from the dead, would end up raising himself from the dead too. And then all of a sudden down the road, as the disciples look back, as the writer John looks back, as Lazarus and Mary and Martha look back on the incident, they went, oh, I see what Jesus was doing. I see what he was up to. And it's in that moment where they leave behind what may be the most profound learning about your pain that you need to understand before you leave here today. It wasn't until hindsight when they realized there may be a delay, but there's always a design. There may be a delay between that moment when pain occurs in your life and it's difficult and it's hard and you're angry at God or you're trying to hang on to your faith by a thread. When you're told, trust me, trust me, trust me, and you just don't see anything that good can come from it. There may be a delay between that and when God does what God does. There may be a delay, but there's always a design. God never wastes a pain. Ever. And so I want to leave you with the same question that Jesus had for Martha. I reworded a little bit, but here it is. Do you trust me? That's the question that Jesus asked Martha. Do you trust me? Do you trust that the one that heals your pain feels your pain? Do you trust that even when there's a delay, there's a design? And while you're wrestling with your answer to that question, I want to invite you to listen to the rest of Tommy's story.
Pretty soon after we talked with the doctors about what was going to kind of happen next, my mind was still filled with kind of shock. I mean, what's going to happen at this point in time? The doctors came to me and told me, they said, we just want to let you know that we pronounced Terry Lynn dead, but your son was born. Would you like to come see him? And during those moments, those bittersweet moments of sorrow, my mind was still racing with the thoughts of, where do I go from here? You know, I had choices to make in life where, which direction do I go? You know, what am I going to do, you know, raising this family by myself? You know, God, this is not what I had planned. This is not the way life is supposed to work. Even through wrestling through those feelings, God guided me to concentrate on my son, Thomas, and his well-being. There was a lot of sorrow and pain, obviously, and a lot of questions I had, but God helped me focus in on what was important. Helped me not wrestle with that why question that pops into our heads. He gave me a kind of a direction of, you know, you don't really need to know why right now, Tommy. I need you to just lean on me. Let me take you through the steps. And that got me through a lot of tough times with when you're alone. You know, a lot of people say, how did you do it? How could you even face that? And I don't know. I don't know, but I know God gave me that. Not maybe the answers, but maybe a desire not to know the answers. You know, I see things every day through the experience I've had, the decisions I make on a day-to-day basis. That moment in time influences my decisions today. You know, I tell a lot of people, it's like, and maybe it's a cliche, but it's like I have a different pair of glasses on and I see the world in a totally different mindset. God has really shown me through my experiences how to be humble, how to put others first in life. Sometimes I do think about it could be a totally different situation where my life could have changed for the worse during that time. And I could have abandoned God and what he taught me and his will for my life. And I could have been a totally different path and a bitter, hateful person. But there's not a day that doesn't go by that he doesn't remind me of the blessings I have, even through that situation and through what happened to me, how every person I come in contact with is a child of God that he loves, and he wants me to show Christ to them.